Hi, everyone.
So easy.
It is 5:17. We're going to get started. If everyone on Zoom can hear me, that's great. And I will let my Vice President, Miranda Thompson, take over.
Hi, so thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Miranda Thompson, for those of you who don't know me. It's a Friday evening during midterms and really close to spring break, and so I am really ecstatic to see such a turnout. I think it is definitely attributable to our great lineup of speakers. So I do want to say firstly to our speakers, thank you so much for being so flexible for all the last minute changes. And I do want to thank Dean Cummings for really connecting us with these speakers last minute. So when Molly approached me about founding ACS with her, I did my research into the national branch and I fell in love with this event. I knew that starting a new chapter could be difficult, but the one thing I wanted to ensure before we left is that we could create an annual tradition to encourage the most honest and open, albeit difficult conversations. And I hope that all of us getting together tonight here will be the beginning of leaving that mark. So I am happy to hand it over now to Molly Sanders, and let's get this started.
I have notes, I'm sorry. It won't be long. As Miranda said, I really appreciate you all coming. I can't thank my board. If you guys can raise your hand on the board, please. I'd like everyone to give a round of applause to the board. Without them, this event would not have happened, and I especially want to thank my Vice President, Miranda. She's been my partner in crime. She's been my right hand in everything. She gets things done. She's a bold woman, as Micki Davis has said to both of us. And I just really appreciate the speakers for coming and everyone on Zoom. I cannot thank you enough for all the flexible changes that we've had, the up and downs with this event, but it was very, very important for me and Miranda to establish this event. It is a huge event for ACS across the board and nationally. We really wanted to have these open concepts and discussions about the curiosities, about the things that make us uncomfortable, about things that need to be brought to this campus. So it has been a privilege and pleasure to work with such an amazing board and amazing speakers to get this event going. And I really, really, really appreciate all of the turnout. It has been surprising to me. I'm in utter shock, honestly. I'm actually shaking as we speak. So please enjoy yourselves, enjoy the food. Please ask any question, any curiosity you have. These speakers are here to tell you what they have and tell you their research. So thank you so much. I'm also going to be here to introduce our very own Micki Davis. She is Widener's Chief Diversity Officer. As Chief Diversity Officer, she was responsible for the university's diversity efforts, including all faculty, staff, student diversity initiatives. Micki is the founding director of the university's Multicultural Student Affairs Office, which she has led for more than 10 years and has more than 25 years of progressive experience in higher education. Through her work with the university's Multicultural Student Affairs Office, she has served as a primary resource and facilitator for multicultural, cultural competence, social justice, quality and diversity related programs, workshops for students, faculty, and staff. She's co-founded Widener's Faculty and Administrators of Color Network, Widener's Women Leadership Forum, and she also coordinates the university's Safe Space Ally training and has promoted the We Are All Widener Pluralism campaign, which is the foundation for the university's nationally known Common Ground initiative. She's been given several distinguished awards, and please give a warm welcome to Micki Davis.
How's everybody doing? Does everybody have food? Because you're in store for an amazing evening. As you've already heard, I'm Micki Davis, and I have the pleasure of being the Chief Diversity Officer. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I was just so excited when I got the invitation from Molly, because I just want to set the tone for today, and then I'm going to get out of the way because there's some amazing speakers that are just want to really beckon you to listen, to be energized, and to be encouraged. We know pretty much the mission of ACS, but I just want to talk about why it's so important that Molly and the board that thought that we should have chapter of ACS here at Commonwealth. Some of you know I come back and forth, I visit, and I know how amazing that you are. But having a chapter of ACS is really important because it gives you an opportunity to just really learn how you can be engaged and how as law professionals that you can impact society. We know that right now the political climate here in our country is divisive at best. And as I said to Molly and Miranda earlier, first of all, I did tell them that they're super women. I told them that they're bold. Because anytime that you start something, that you create something where there is nothing, right? And you come with a vision. And the other thing is amazing that they have a board. And so the board members who raised their hands, you know, I always say that those who create, they see the vision in Technicolor, right? The rest of us, we can just see it in black and white, but we trust, right, the visionaries. And so when you create something out of nothing, it's amazing, but also something that really has its purpose here and needs to be here. I want to remind you that we talked about just as young law professionals or law professionals that you will have and you will enjoy special privilege. You will enjoy the privilege of engaging, of protecting, of advocating, but also to impact society. And so the opportunity that you have tonight before you is an opportunity to learn, to gain knowledge. Sometimes I talk about this space of discomfort, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. So one of my ground rules is that to see a space of discomfort as a space for growth. And so, you know, ACS being here will allow those opportunities for you to get uncomfortable, but also I want to encourage you to do like to step your toe in the water. You know how you go to the beach and you put your toe in the water, it's really cold at first, and then how you get used to it. And so tonight's activity or event or the speakers are engaging, they're exciting. I want you to put your toe in the water. I want you, even when you find some spaces that you may be a little uncomfortable, I want you to think about that as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for you to continue to build the knowledge that you need, the knowledge base, but also remember as law professionals, some of you will have clients, some of you will be in the corporate realm, some of you will return back as professors. And as I said earlier, you are the generation that is not afraid to be uncomfortable. Right? You are the generation that is not afraid to ask questions. You are the generation that thinks creativity as to how to change things. And so the tone for tonight is just that, to sit back, to be energized, to learn, to be open-minded, right? To be able to think outside of the boxes sometimes that we're socialized to be in. Also want to just mention how the chapter of ACS here fits into the overall university theme of DE&I. Now, many of you know that President Robertson, who's been with us now about maybe 20 months or so, also brought belonging to that. So we're DEIB. And actually, when we started doing DEIB and then belonging, I was like, well, we've kind of been doing that. You know, we're kind of there. But then there's so much that we've learned. And so again, as I think about how having a chapter of ACS here just, you know, blends into the fabric that we're creating across our 3 campuses, one of belongings, all of the foundational pieces are here. The inclusive spaces, allowing spaces for diverse voices. Voices from all over. Tonight you will hear 4 different voices that will be sharing. And so that's an inclusive space. It means that, you know, we're trying to see whose voice is not here. How do we invite those voices to the table, right? Even many times that have been marginalized. Thoughts and ideas and perspectives, right, that have not been allowed into the mainstream. These are the things that I'm going to encourage you to immerse yourselves in. Also, the space that we're in tonight, promoting dialogue. Honest, you know, and if I were facilitating this, I talk about ground rules, and hopefully that you'll be in a space where you'll be able to share and think and ask questions and engage. The other thing is advocacy. Advocacy is really important. You are an advocate already, many of you. And you will be advocating and sometimes in spaces where there may be that discomfort that we just talked about and that you will grow. And those that you are advocating for will grow. But also remember that many times when others see themselves in your advocacy, when they see their issues and their concerns reflected in your advocacy, right, they feel validated. They are empowered. Because belonging is a space of empowerment as well. And so when people see you advocating for them, when you are speaking, when their voices have been silent, they feel validated and they feel like they belong. And then the final building block is that, again, of educational opportunity I talked a little bit about. An opportunity for you to learn, opportunity for you to engage, an opportunity for you to build those building blocks that are going to allow you to go out and impact and change society that we're in. And so I'm going to get out of the way, as I said, because I know you've got some great speakers. Again, I want to give Molly and Miranda a hand again because we spent some time in the office and we were going on and on. They were being called, about the event, and we're talking superpower stuff. But all of you, again, and I've met many of you in your 1L classes, are superpowers, and you have a super dean coming in. And so I know that this campus, I know that you as students, I know that you're going to leave this campus and you're going to be charged up, you're going to be knowledgeable, you're not going to be afraid to be in those places of discomfort. You're going to ask questions, you're going to remain curious, and you're going to be a blessing to those that you encounter that are already waiting for you. So with that, I hope I set the tone, and we are getting ready to move ahead, and we're going to be engaged.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Gill, and I'm a 2L here, and I'm also a proud member of Asian Pacific American Law Student Association. So today I've been tasked to give a brief introduction for our next speaker. And that felt a bit ironic because our law professors here, like I think all law professors, have a unique talent of calling 100 to 200 pages of nightly reading. So I knew exactly what that meant. And secondly, because of the impeccable achievements of our next speaker, this is anything but brief. So our next esteemed speaker is Atiba or Ellis. He's the Laura B. Chisholm Distinguished Research Scholar and a professor of law at Case Western Reserve University. A nationally noted voting rights scholar. His primary research focuses on how racial and class-based oppression interact, continues to abridge and deny the right to vote to communities on the margins of American democracy. His work has analyzed voter identification laws for their socioeconomic effects, situated felon disenfranchisement laws as enforcing a political underclass, analyzed the theoretical scope of the Citizens United decision, and described the ideological drivers of vote suppression. His work is interdisciplinary in nature, spanning doctrinal legal analysis, critical political theory, race and the law, legal history, and innovative legal pedagogy. In addition to his scholarly research, Professor Ellis frequently blogs, presents academic lectures, and provides commentary on issues regarding race and the law of politics, and other civil rights and constitutional law matters. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Professor.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying it's rather surreal to just be looking at myself in a computer. But I'm glad to be here with you today and glad to talk with you on this very important topic around racial healing in the United States and its boundaries and its potential. I did not realize until about 30 seconds ago that I would be going first. And Dean Clark and Professor Ramirez both seem to have this habit of throwing me up front when it comes to talks like this, and then ask Professor Ramirez about how he forgot how he put me up first the last time we did a Zoom panel like this. But I'll save that for his presentation. But seriously, friends, I want to talk for a few minutes about an idea around American democracy specifically and racial healing. And the claim that I want to make quite simply is that the ideology of colorblindness is the ultimate obstacle to the possibilities of racial healing in the United States today. Specifically, if we are thinking about this from the context of a racial reconciliation that truly expands and makes inclusive our American political community. Now, I want to expand on this in as much as in the last term of the Supreme Court, the court offered two opinions which seem completely unrelated and, in a sense, completely taking the court in opposite directions. One of those was the decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus the Fellows of Harvard College, where the use of race-conscious metrics in college admissions was deemed unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, under the tests articulated in Bakke, in Fisher, and other cases around race-conscious admissions. And the other opinion that I want to point out, and which may seem unrelated, but by the end of this talk, I want to relate it, is the decision in Allen v. Milligan. Now, Allen v. Milligan was the decision coming out of Alabama concerning Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the court, in a split decision, said the Voting Rights Act would not be struck down, that use of race-conscious metrics in determining whether fair districts were being drawn is appropriate and should continue. Now, these two things say different things about race and how to think about it. But I would argue today that the tie between the two is colorblindness. And what is not apparent in 2024 will likely become apparent in the future, that the court, at least this iteration of the Supreme Court, will trend towards a movement towards colorblindness, and that it signaled in the Harvard decision its ideological trajectory in this regard. And it is only a matter of time before the court's reductive vision of colorblindness reaches the Voting Rights Act. Now, this is controversial. The received wisdom about the Allen decision is that the Voting Rights Act still stands. And that's good news as far as it goes. If you read the opinion closely, you realize that, well, Justice Roberts took a very narrow reading, sort of the minimal approach to stare decisis that one could have around these issues is the approach that he took. And in that sense, we have the Voting Rights Act hanging as a thread. Now, why focus on the Voting Rights Act? Well, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is, in essence, the modern fix that Congress created in the face of 2 centuries of racial authoritarianism that counterbalanced the democracy, if one can call it that the founders imagined in the creation of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution of 1789 that governs our country today. Or to put it another way, the country arguably has been designed as a republic, but it is a republic that is premised on white supremacy. And that the Voting Rights Act is the moment in American history, not Reconstruction, well, although ironically, Reconstruction gave us 11 years of a multiracial democracy for white and Black men, not women. But aside from that 11 years, the Voting Rights Act was the thing that fulfilled the promise of political equality in the United States on the basis of race. Given this history, right, given this fact, we have to focus, at least my claim in part is that we have to focus on the fact that America as a democracy that is truly open to all on the basis of race is a relatively new thing. It is no more than 2 generations old. So by reading on to it, the belief that through our laws and through our evolution that we reach this notion of a political equality that is open and accessible to all, and that will stay that way. And therefore, we don't need race-conscious laws in order to ensure racial equality, at least in its formal sense, more or less racial healing and a coming together into one kind of organic political community. That notion becomes problematic because if for no other reason, then we have very little experience at it. Now, I want to argue to you that we have tried to get here. Again and again and again, we have tried. And in this latest iteration of this experiment to form a racially inclusive political community, SFFA versus Harvard sows the seeds of the next setback, despite the fact that Alan V. Milligan tells us that the Voting Rights Act is at least here to stay for now. That irony that the court can say 2 different things, but they really mean one thing, the experiment may fail again, is what I want to talk about a little bit. And to give this some perspective, I want to talk for a few minutes about the experiments as they have failed, and then why this latest experiment in inclusiveness is in danger of failing. And then at the end, with time remaining, we can imagine anew what an inclusive political community might look like. Now, the premise here is that America, for this 60 years of Voting Rights Act inclusiveness, is a multiracial democracy, means that the 200 years prior is at best a democracy where white citizens usually had more equality than all others and were able to participate when it came closest to democracy, but all other citizens could not. Now, to be clear, the evidence on this point seems very straightforward, and let me recite it a little bit, right? If we look at the Constitution as conceived of in 1789, we see parts of it that leave the laws to the states in terms of who ought to be included and how that inclusion should happen. But we also see provisions like the 3/5 compromise and all of the rules around the fugitive slave clause that signal strongly that this Constitution is designed to support a political economy of slavery. And moreover, even for free Blacks, as Alexis de Tocqueville of all people pointed out, those folks in terms of getting to exercise their franchise often were intimidated from voting and did not get the opportunity to vote in and of itself. This seems to lead to evidence of a racial authoritarian state. Indeed, that racial authoritarianism was given its crowning glory by the Supreme Court itself in Dred Scott v. Sanford, where all persons of African descent, slave or free, were to be treated as property under Chief Justice Taney's decision. Now, I have written a little bit about this in a series that I like to call my Tiered Personhood series, including Citizens United and Tiered Personhood and the Excluded Voter, that the process of creating a democratic state, democratic in quotes there, is one of actually creating tiers of personhood who get to participate in the political community and those who get excluded from it. Of course, the first effort at repair in this regard was Reconstruction. The twin aims of Reconstruction, as I wrote in another article called Reviving the Dream, were to provide formerly enslaved persons the twin arms of inclusion through social and economic inclusion and political inclusion, political and social equality. Of course, the 13th Amendment in abolishing slavery sought to do this. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866 made explicit that all citizens get the same rights to property and contract as white citizens. Ironic that there is a law still on the books today in Section 1982 and 1981 of Title 42 of the U.S. Code that is that race conscious. But therein is the answer, right? Therein is the answer that we used race conscious tools in order to effect a kind of inclusion in order to correct for a racial authoritarian state. But as quickly as we did that in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and even the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, we started undoing it. We started undoing it, and the Supreme Court is a culprit of this. In the civil rights cases of 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 also provided this inclusion in terms of ensuring that public accommodations were equally available to all. But then, of course, in the civil rights cases, the 1875 Act was struck down. In the slaughterhouse cases, the 15th and 14th Amendments, well, I should say the 14th Amendment was limited to state action, and the 13th Amendment was cabined to addressing slavery directly, and more importantly, the Privileges and Immunities Clause was eviscerated. And then comes Plessy v. Ferguson and racial segregation being legalized, and then a case that you don't often hear about called Giles v. Harris, which came in 1903, which basically said that the Supreme Court would not help, in this case, Alabamans. Interesting how history seems to come in circles. Alabamans who alleged that the white political structure was designed to exclude them, the Supreme Court of that time would not help. In the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes, there is no claim that they could bring. Now, the Voting Rights Act was supposed to be a fix to this. And yes, for a time it worked, especially when amended in 1960, when passed in 1965 and amended in 1982, it addresses racial gerrymandering as well as on-the-ground voter exclusion. But in cases that we all have heard in the news lately, like Shelby County v. Holder, which ultimately eviscerated Section 5 of that act, and thus states with a history of discrimination do not have a check on them. And then you go through Section 2 litigation, which was narrowed in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, that the game is now designed once again for states who have a mind to discriminate. And so the litigation to discriminate often takes years, and the products of that discrimination can often repeat themselves. So strict voter identification laws, rules that hyper-regulate the act of casting votes. I'm thinking of Georgia and making it illegal to give someone a bottle of water while they're standing in line to vote. I'm thinking about states that allowed the forced voting during COVID. And even today, where voter registration becomes more difficult, and there are some states which, as recognized by the court, surgically attack the rights of minorities. We're seeing a reemergence of this. And though I realize I've gone pretty much to the limit of my time, I want to point out that this colorblindness notion, as articulated in the Harvard decision, is one that would take to the extreme the notion that not only private universities or even public universities, but the government itself should be skeptical, if not hostile, to any sort of race-conscious remedies around acts that the government does, including voting. And in that sense, it would seem that the Voting Rights Act, the ultimate in race conscious acts, is on the chopping block, if not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Now, how do we reimagine all this? The one, I would give you three thoughts very quickly. First, let's not assume that the constitutional design was meant to be in favor of all of us in a political community. We should have skepticism about this. Second, knowing that race consciousness is actually a tool to help inclusion rather than seeing it as an obstacle. And third, asking ourselves, what does fair representation look like? I'll save that conversation for the comments, but that strikes me as the heart of understanding how to get to a fair political community. And once we all work on a fair basis, then we can talk about racial healing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. Hi, everyone. My name is Tina Gill. I am a 1L here, and I'm the 1L rep for APOLSA. I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ramirez. Professor Ramirez is an Abner J. Mikva Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Business Law at Loyola University, Chicago Law School. He is a widely recognized scholar and has published extensively in the areas of law and economics, financial regulation, and corporate governance. Professor Ramirez's scholarly focus on the racial hierarchy that exists in the realm of macroeconomics and corporate governance has put him at the forefront of aiding in establishing an anti-racist legacy at Loyola. He is a change agent for social justice and a compassionate voice that simultaneously educates and supports. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ramirez.
Hello, everybody. I think I'll start by dissenting from Professor Ellis's view that I somehow influenced the order of speakers. Just to be clear, I had no influence whatsoever over this. And insofar as he has launched an accusation that I've done this in the past, I don't know what he's talking about. And I'll just leave it at that. I have a PowerPoint. I'm not exactly sure how to activate the PowerPoint, if I'm going to do it or if it shall be done. I think I'm going to do it. Can you all see that?
See that you're sharing a screen.
There it is.
Nice. And I wonder if I can hit slideshow from the beginning. We'll see. There we go. Nice. So Dre Cummings and I are writing a book together, ending the racialized war on drugs, repairing victimized communities. And I think that title kind of encapsulates the points that I want to make today in terms of racial healing. First of all, I thought that Professor Ellis did a stellar job of walking us through a quick history of how our society became burdened with the racial hierarchy that you see everywhere today. Everything from childhood poverty to educational funding to life expectancy, all of it breaks down by race. And What we're focusing on when we talk about the racialized war on drugs is the fact that even though it's been established again and again and again and again that whites and Latinos and African Americans use drugs at similar rates. In fact, there's a disproportionate enforcement of the war on drugs that was intended from the beginning that led to very high incarceration rates for African Americans and Latinos for drug offenses and very low incarceration rates for whites. So when you think about that, and you think about the points that Professor Ellis made with respect to voting, you can see where this is an effective tool for really sort of smashing the voting power of minority communities and impoverishing minority communities on an intergenerational basis and on a very deep basis, right? Because when you talk about mass incarceration, you're not just talking about voter disenfranchisement. You're not just talking about felony disenfranchisement for life. You're also talking about things like the revival of the 3/5 rule. Because what happens with mass incarceration is when a prison opens up in a rural county, all of that prison population is counted as population of that rural county, even though none of the prisoners vote. So it's as if we're going back to the South and plantations where you have 3/5 of the slaves being counted for purposes of House of Representatives apportionment, even though none of them vote, right? So the reality here is that you can think about the mass incarceration of people of color in America for conduct that is very similar to conduct that whites undertake as not just an offense against individuals, but as an offense against communities of color across America. Because what you're doing is you're decimating those communities of color politically, and then economically, you're burdening those people of color who are ensnared by the mass incarceration related to the war on drugs, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, as I will show. So the war starts with Richard Nixon, and really it's become quite apparent more recently, and my co-author Dre and I have focused on this in a series of law review articles that we wrote on the topic, that it was really related to Nixon's Southern strategy and had a specific target of people of color and war protesters. The war itself has accomplished very little, yet the damage from the war on drugs stands at record highs. And the war drives racial oppression in communities of color on an ongoing transgenerational basis. In other words, when you're a youth in a community of color that is being over-policed and subject to mass incarceration, you're suffering trauma at a very young age. And you're suffering constricted employment opportunities because your community is being faced with constricted buying power and constricted employment. Just by being in the community, you suffer these things, right? Not to mention if you should be a victim of over-policing and then tossed in jail pursuant to our system of criminal injustice. So, yeah, take a look at this. You know, a lot of people who believe in race as some kind of like, you know, real thing as opposed to a social construction, like to talk about how many people of color are in jail as if it's their fault. But the reality is that social construction of mass incarceration is vividly depicted in this chart, coming from all places, the American Enterprise Institute, which is relatively conservative, but understands the injustice of the war on drugs. And you see that we go from 200 per 100,000 population to almost 1,000. Now, I can assure you, humanity did not change between 1925 and 2019 to justify that. Humans didn't suddenly become evil. Americans did not suddenly become evil. Instead, what we did is we socially constructed a war on drugs that ensnared countless numbers of Americans to the extent of driving incarceration rates 5 times as high as they historically had been. And even historically, you can see that they weren't even always 200 per 100,000. Early on, when we had even less of a prohibition society, it was below 200, but it goes to 1,000 shortly after the war on drugs that Richard Nixon inaugurated. So this is the impact on people of color. You can see here that when you look at prison incarceration rates, you see that more than anyone else, African Americans have suffered from the war on drugs, followed secondly by Latino Americans, and that white Americans basically get a free pass. And I saw this in my own life, and Dre Cummings has talked about this too. In my own life, I was fortunate enough to go to a wealthy, largely white high school on the North Shore of Chicago, and people were smoking like crazy. I mean, they need chimneys in that high school for all the smoking going on. And I remember seeing plenty of drug deals going down in the halls. I'm not going to name any names, but it was very common. Nobody went to jail. Nobody got expelled. You know what I mean? There was no pipeline to prison at my high school. Instead, there was look the other way, wink and a nod. But, you go just a few miles south to Chicago and you get into the city public school, the Chicago public school system, and all of a sudden you see mass expulsions, mass detentions, and ultimately convictions leading to jail. So the prison, the high school experience is as much about going to prison as it is learning how to get into college, if not more so. And I think this chart captures all of that oppression. So what's going on here? Well, this is an article that I recently found that I thought was very interesting in thinking about why do we even have this war on drugs? People on the left and the right really kind of like should find common ground on this. For progressives, the proposal that state-financed distribution of resources to disadvantaged communities would promote social equality is a compelling position for those interested in social justice. For conservatives, if you tout the value of small business ownership, drug war reparations would provide economic support to entrepreneurs previously harmed by excessive governmental regulation. So whether you're a libertarian or you believe that the state can improve on market outcomes, it comes to the same result when it comes to the war on drugs. There really is no morally justifiable reason for why this war on drugs continues. And there's little accountability for public officials who enforce unjust laws and destroy people's lives through incarceration. The payment of reparations could at least help heal the racial scars that we see everywhere in America today, from childhood through adult. In virtually every measure of social well-being, we see whites living the best, Latinos suffering relative to whites, and African Americans suffering relative to everyone else, from life expectancy on down. So why, right? Why? Well, Professor Ellis, my good friend Atiba Ellis, made the point that, look, it's not an accident. It was sort of baked into the origins of our republic and our Constitution. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And at a certain point, we need to recognize that 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education and 60 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that if state actors continue to deploy policies and laws in a way that leads to disparate impact, then we should impute to them a discriminatory purpose. In other words, it's not an accident. If you have an unjustifiable disparate impact, it's not an accident if you allow it to continue. Your part in participating in the continuation of that disparate impact is complicity for purposes of discriminatory purpose. And so as a result, this all should violate the 14th Amendment. And Dre and I took that position in an article published in the University of Arkansas Little Rock Law Review entitled The Racist Origins of the War on Drugs. And so I think this is from our Tulane piece in terms of money. I mean, in terms of why do we have this war on drug? Why do we let it continue? It's a great mystery to me. Certainly, if you look at it from a sheer economic point of view, which is sort of my specialty, law and macroeconomics, you're looking at an expenditure of about $150 billion per annum for this nonsense. I mean, it's just total insanity. $150 billion for putting Americans in jail. How do you get there? That's nuts. We're spending $150 billion to impose mass oppression on American citizens. And the destruction of human capital is even worse. According to Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist, when you add it all up, you're looking at $400 billion a year in lost earnings and associated tax revenues. So we got about a 25% federal tax rate overall. So 400 billion in earnings is 100 billion in tax revenues. You put that together with the 150 billion per annum that we're spending on this ridiculous war on drugs, you're at $250 billion a year of our money that's being spent to put co-citizens in jail for doing the same thing that rich white folks do with no penalty whatsoever. So, yeah, economically, again, complete senselessness. There's no way to justify this degree of oppression in our society. The most important and powerful step our government can now take to preserve our democracy and save our constitutional republic from white supremacist attempts to lawlessly install autocratic minority rule is ending the war on drugs. So this is the impact of all the money we've spent. As you can see, drug addiction is stubbornly constant at about 1.5% of the population. But notice that through the years, we spend all this money, $1.5 trillion from 1970 when we started the ridiculous war on drugs through 2010, and drug addiction goes nowhere. It goes absolutely nowhere. And when you look at drug overdoses, you see that drug overdoses are at an all-time high, that the war on drugs has done nothing to protect people from drug overdoses, and consequently, this criminalization of what is in fact a social pathology requiring medical treatment has been a failure by any measure you can imagine. It's been a failure by any measure you can imagine, which is why think tanks on both the left and the right agree that the war on drugs has failed. So, oppressive inertia or racism by silence. It's a fine line, isn't it? We allow these things to go on and on and on. We allow people to continue to suffer. We allow the racial oppression to continue to fester, and we act like we're not doing anything, like it's not our fault, like we're not in on it. We're all in on it to the extent we don't resist. 83% of Americans understand that the war on drugs has failed. Only 12% believe it's a success, and yet it continues. 65% support ending the war on drugs. 66% support eliminating criminal penalties for drug possession and reinvesting drug enforcement resources into treatment and addiction services, and yet it continues. Support among Democrats, 85%, independents, 72%, and even among Republicans, support for ending the war on drugs is 40%. So when you look at these numbers, what you see is a great political opportunity for ending this very oppressive reality called the war on drugs, and yet it's not happening. So Biden, to his credit, has done more than any other president in our history to end this kind of oppression. And he seems to be on the road to rescheduling cannabis. He has pardoned some drug offenders, many compared to prior presidents. But we're talking, he's pardoning them by the dozen, right? And we need to pardon them by the thousands. And so that has led to a real outcry in Congress. A bunch of Democratic senators have sent a letter to the DEA saying, why are you not deschedulizing cannabis as at least a first step for ending the war on drugs. And the DEA hasn't replied, even though the United States Senate, the 6 senators asked for a reply by February 12th, which, if 6 senators ask me to reply to anything by February 12th, I'm sending it February 11th, right? So I don't know why these agencies think they can get away with this, but this is the Biden administration. And I think that it's time to push back on this hard. And I think the reality is that Biden's claim that the election of 2024 is a grave threat to our democracy is spot on. After all, how many ex-presidents participated in an insurrection like what we saw on January 6th? The administration claims no one should be in jail for cannabis, but we know that there are still plenty of people in jail for cannabis. We need youth voters who have been alienated from the Biden campaign, not to mention Latino voters and African-American voters who are also being alienated from the Biden campaign. And yet the DEA, the Biden administration DEA, is dragging its feet on descheduling cannabis. President Biden should immediately take action to deschedule cannabis and free those incarcerated for cannabis. In fact, I think if cannabis played any role whatsoever in an arrest, in an arrest that led to no physical harm by anyone, then that person should be freed. In other words, if the probable cause for the search warrant of the vehicle was I smelled cannabis, then the felon in possession of a firearm should be freed. And that would amount to thousands and thousands of pardons between now and Election Day. And it would really, I think, show that the Biden administration is very serious about its commitment to social justice and ending the war on drugs. So feel free to email me with any questions, thoughts, or comments, and I'll let the next person speak.
You can get his email for you. Thank you so much, Professor Ramirez. So I am very excited to introduce our next speaker. I was really lucky to meet Dean Cummings at his dean interview meeting. I'm pretty sure 2 days later, I emailed him asking him if he would want to speak at this event because I knew he would be perfect for it. Dean Cummings is an accomplished leader, scholar, award-winning professor, and the incoming dean to our school. He's currently serving as the Associate Dean for Faculty Development at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock's William H. Bowen School of Law. His 2023 Faculty Award for Excellence in Social Justice shines light on the widespread recognition of his work in this area, and we're really lucky to have him here today. Not only is he the author of 3 books and over 40 law review articles specializing in topics such as social justice and economic equality, he is also the co-director of the Center for Racial Justice and Criminal Justice Reform at the Bowen School of Law. His leadership has prevailed due to his strong incentives to promote inclusion and belonging, and his prolific ideas stand out in legal academia. Please join me in welcoming Dean Cummings.
I am absolutely delighted to be here with each of you this evening, and I am so enthusiastic about being your next dean. Cannot wait for May 31st, my start date. In fact, this is my 2nd trip to Harrisburg since the job offer was accepted, and I just keep coming back. I wanted to start tonight by acknowledging Miranda and Molly for putting this event together. Fantastic work to the rest of the ACS board. I'm a huge fan of the American Constitution Society, was a part at West Virginia University, my first stop in my teaching career of getting their organization chapter started. So I'm very delighted to be here supporting the chapter start here. I also wanted to mention that I'm really grateful for Micki Davis and her terrific introduction. She set a wonderful tone. And to my friends and colleagues, Atiba Ellis, Stephen Ramirez, and Todd Clark, for joining us in this exciting, I hope you're finding, presentation this evening. I will admit that I am the one that switched the order up. So thank you, Atiba, for leaving me out of that blame. Steve, that might explain why you were blamed for that. But I switched it because I wanted to be a bridge between Professor Ramirez and Dean Clark. Professor Ramirez and I are co-authors. We've written several articles together, and we currently have a book proposal out on ending the war on drugs. And Dean Clark and I have written several articles together, and we have a book out called Corporate Justice. So I felt like I should bridge the two and talk a little bit for a few minutes about the work that I've done with Professor Ramirez and the work that I've done with Dean Clark. So I wanted to mention just a couple of things. In the war on drugs, I think it's really important to recognize that it wasn't just Richard Nixon that started the war on drugs. He's the one that pronounced it. Ronald Reagan put the war on drugs on steroids, and Bill Clinton supercharged the war on drugs. So it isn't a partisan blame game here. Both sides of the aisle are responsible for this horrifying war on drugs, as Professor Ramirez described, which is disproportionately enforced. See, we're recording, so I will say this, and we'll see if anyone has anything to say about it later. The war on drugs has bastardized policing in the United States. My brother, before he passed, was police. This is not an anti-police screed. This is that the incentives of policing have been bastardized by the war on drugs. Here's why. When Reagan was president in the 1980s, only 1 or 2% of the United States of American citizens were concerned about drug use because it wasn't that big a deal. It wasn't a national concern. It wasn't anything law enforcement at the time were concerned about, things like kidnappings, murders, child abuse, etc. But Ronald Reagan, after seeing the success of the division of the Southern Strategy by Richard Nixon, decided he was going to make the war on drugs an important, critical part of his campaign and his presidency. And so he started with rhetoric like our country's being wiped out by drug use. It is destroying communities. It is destroying lives. And let me also say, personally, in a family that has had drug addiction problems, we're not talking about something that's not a big deal. Drug addiction is. How we deal with it is what's political and what's difficult and what has been problematic in our country. So Ronald Reagan, when all of the law enforcement agencies throughout the United States were turning a deaf ear to his plea to make drug intervention a primary policing activity, when police chiefs were not listening, he incentivized law enforcement to make drug enforcement their top priority by offering them federal weaponry to their police departments if they would start making drug enforcement their number one priority, by putting seizures of drugs in place that would then benefit police departments, could keep the proceeds of the seizures, the cash, for their police departments. He incentivized policing to make drug enforcement priority number one. And what did that mean? What did that turn into? For someone that grew up in Los Angeles, California, in the south central area of LA, what that meant is in our neighborhoods, police helicopters were flying over our homes nightly on the hour, shining spotlights into our yards, looking for drug abuse. It meant battering rams and SWAT tanks and flashbang grenades being thrown into the homes of citizens of the United States. Ronald Reagan made it a war on U.S. citizens' cities, but disproportionately, right? Not in the beach cities, not on Wall Street, where drug abuse is rampant. I'm not saying any of you all, but not in sorority houses or fraternities in universities across the United States. The drug war was never waged there. It was in poor communities of color and poor rural communities. And so policing, making drug enforcement priority number one, started abusing the citizenry of the United States, which now leads me to the pivot and transition of the work Dean Todd Clark and I are doing together. But Dean Todd Clark and I, a couple of years ago, started researching trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Are you guys familiar with the term ACEs and childhood trauma? I'll just give you a couple of quick things. In the 1990s, a couple of researchers, Dr. Anda and Dr. Filiti in San Diego, started doing research with obese patients. And they stumbled upon something that startled them. Nearly every obese patient that they worked with, after going through intake, described some pretty horrifying childhood trauma, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, like living with an addicted parent, or living with an incarcerated parent. And these researchers found some mind-boggling health information I wanted to share with you. They made a list of 10 adverse childhood experiences, 10 things that they said leads to childhood trauma. Divorce, abuses of the kinds I mentioned, community disruption, violence, home insecurity, food insecurity, living with an addicted parent, living with an incarcerated parent. And of these 10 ACEs they identified, they started asking their obesity patients that they were researching with how many had they suffered. Startlingly, more than 66% of our country has suffered at least one ACE. Of the 15% that have suffered 4 ACEs, they were 3 times more likely to have heart disease, 4 times more likely to suffer from obesity, 7 times more likely to suffer from suicidality. And if you had 6 or more ACEs as a child, your life expectancy was 20 years less than someone that had 0. And I just want to describe to you guys how common ACEs are. When I saw the list of 10, I've assumed my whole life that I've had 0 ACEs. And when I went through the list and thought hard about it, I have 2 of the list. If you have 6 or more, chances are you're going to live 60 fewer years. Sorry, 6 or more, you're going to live 20 fewer years than someone that has 0. So one of the things that Dean Clark and I started arguing was that the way communities of color are policed and the way the criminal legal system does communities of color, we argue that those should be counted as ACEs too. Because if you live in a hyper-policed community, or if you live in a system, a criminal legal system that the war on drugs has put in place, those systems are disproportionately discriminatory against communities of color and poor rural populations. So why do we live in a country that allows policing to traumatize Black and brown families? Why do we live in a country where we allow a criminal legal system to disproportionately charge and sentence communities of color? And so our work that Professor Clark, that Dean Clark and I did together on trauma suggests some responses to those questions. And so now Dean Clark and I are going to do something that we often do, which is I'm going to step to the side and we're going to tag team a little bit on our trauma work. I would love for someone to come up and introduce Dean Todd Clark. And then he and I are going to spend our last few minutes together talking about trauma and policing.
Hello, everyone. I am Paige Oistridge. I'm a first-year law student at Widener Law Commonwealth. I am excited to present our next speaker. Joining the panel, Dean Todd Clark, who is the current dean of the Widener University Delaware Law School, our sister law school. Dean Clark is an avid scholar and writes on legal issues involving employment discrimination, explores the intersection of hip hop culture and the law and corporate justice. He published book chapters in the Oxford Handbook of American Sports Law, published by the University of Oxford Press, and is in a book published by the Carolina Academic Press entitled Hip Hop and the Law. Additionally, Dean Clark has co-authored a textbook with Dean Cummings entitled Corporate Justice that explores the issues of social justice, corporate power, and diversity. Please give a warm welcome to Dean Clark.
Actually, you can leave the camera at the same. Oh, okay. I guess maybe I have to be up here. But one, I want to just say thank you so much for that warm introduction. I also would like to give my thanks and praises to Molly and Miranda for pushing through with this wonderful event. I see that it's well attended. I'm sorry that I cannot be there in person. I also want to give a shout out to my friend, my colleague, Micki Davis. She is absolutely amazing, and it's so energizing to hear her speak. And I really just appreciate all of the support that she provides, not only to Delaware Law School, but to Commonwealth and in Chester. So Micki, you are much appreciated, and I can't wait to see you again soon. I also want to give a shout out to my buddies, Stephen Ramirez and Atiba Ellis. They are absolutely amazing. And I will say this, I'm going to tease Professor Ramirez a little bit, because typically what happens when I end up on a panel with Professor Ramirez, unlike you, Professor Ellis, I end up on the back end. And Professor Ramirez is such a profound speaker. I always end up with this really small amount of time to give my presentation. So either Professor Ramirez puts Atiba on the front, but he puts me on the back end. I also want to really let you guys know you are in for a treat. Dean Cummings is just an amazing person. He's an amazing guy. He's an amazing father. I'm really excited to be working with him as my fellow dean at Widener University. He is very passionate. He has a plan for the law school, and you guys just have no idea how lucky you are to have him. And quite honestly, I'm looking forward to doing just collaborations with Commonwealth. I think we have a host of ideas. Dean Cummings and I have already talked about teaching a couple of classes. One of those classes will be corporate justice. Another one will be either my version of hip hop law and social justice, or his version of hip hop and the American Constitution, or some marriage of the two. But you guys are in for a treat, and I can't wait to work with you. And so what I want to do is kind of capitalizing. Dre did a wonderful, I think Professor Ellis and Professor Ramirez did an excellent job of giving some phenomenal background information. And I love the concept that Professor Cummings mentioned about the transition between the work that I do with Professor Cummings and then the work that he does with Professor Ramirez. I think that's an excellent way of thinking about it, because if you think about America's war on drugs and you think about the over-policing of minority communities, it increases the likelihood that minority children are going to experience parents who have been incarcerated, and the impacts that it has on those children, the trauma that it perpetrates. But before I do that, I want to take a step back and talk about some of the historical research that Dr. Felitti did as when he worked at Kaiser Permanente, which is a managed care facility, as Professor Cummings mentioned, in California. The thing that was really, really interesting about that work, when Dr. Felitti sat down to do it, Professor Cummings mentioned a lot of things about his work. But one thing that happened was, while he was doing this research, he's a very meticulous guy, and he had a lot of pride, and he had a lot of success in his research. And what they did at the time, they ran an obesity clinic. So the clinic was specially designed for people that were 300, 400, 500 pounds overweight, and they had a lot of success in helping people lose weight. And so what happened was, there were about a large number of patients, like 50% of the patients, after losing more than 100 pounds, were just dropping out, just leaving. And then they would abruptly gain back the weight. And Dr. Felitti is like, I can't figure out what's going on. What's the problem? Why are they reverting back to, maybe some of the habits that caused them to become overweight? So he started looking through all of the data, trying to figure out what the problem was. Pouring over it, could not figure it out. So he's like, okay, let me go back and continue to do some research. So in one particular interview with a female participant, he was engaged in a series of questions. And one of the questions he intended to ask this: how old were you when you first had sex? That was the question that he had intended to ask. But instead of asking that, he was asleep and he inadvertently asked, "How much did you weigh when you first had sex?" And the respondent said 40 pounds and immediately started crying. And at that moment, he recognized that, and this is how the trauma and the ACEs came about. He recognized that her obesity was not linked to an insatiable desire just to continue to eat. He recognized that the overeating and then the precipitous increase in weight gain was due to trauma, and that the eating was the response, the remedy to offset the trauma she was experiencing. And that is what the research grew out of. And so that's how Dr. Felitti developed these 10 ACEs. What I think is really compelling, and it's worth noting, and I really want you to appreciate this particular point. Professor Cummings gave you some really stark statistics about the impact of ACEs. The one that really blows me away the most is the last one that he mentioned when he said, if you have 6 or more ACEs relative to someone that has 0, your lifespan will be cut 20 years. Let me give you a little bit more background about that data. That data was extracted from a pool where 70% of the people that participated in that pool were employed and they had college degrees, which meant they were employed in jobs that had reasonable earnings and that had access to health care. So individuals with access to health care and that were gainfully employed in that particular group, if they had 6 or more ACEs, they lived 20 less years than someone had 0. What I have always been curious about, what if you were to reconduct that experience on America's most vulnerable populations when you don't have access to health care and you don't have access to meaningful employment? What would that mean? You'd probably see something where you're likely to live 40 or 50 less years because you don't have access to the resources to make a difference. So those statistics that you heard, those stark statistics, those drastic statistics were based upon populations that had access to healthcare and were highly educated. And so with our work, we really, as Professor Cummings mentioned, or Dean Cummings mentioned, we really wanted to look at, how can we think about this concept of ACEs? And we recognize that the negative experience that young African Americans have with law enforcement in the United States is a trauma. And we've done some really exciting work around that in what we have learned about law enforcement officers, particularly minority law enforcement officers that have experienced trauma, and how it has impacted the police. And sort of in the process of this, I think we've written 3 articles, one at St. Thomas, one at the University of Cincinnati, one at Case Western Law Review, actually 4 articles, and one at University of Arkansas, Little Rock. And then we're also working on a book proposal for this particular piece now and doing some great work around it. And part of the thing that we're trying to look at is we're looking at the impact of adverse childhood experiences, not just on the individuals within the community, but we're looking at a full 360-degree approach, because we're looking at how those adverse childhood experiences impact prosecutors, how it impacts judges, and how it impacts law enforcement. So we're doing some really comprehensive research to really rethink the way that trauma impacts these communities so that we can provide some meaningful tools to really offset that war on drugs, the over incarceration of minorities and communities of color.
Fantastic work, Dean Clark. Let me just add one thing to that, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. The only thing that I would add to Dean Clark's excellent exposition is that in these interviews we conducted with African-American police officers, to a person, these African-American police officers had suffered significant trauma at the hands of the police when they were young. One of the officers had a shotgun put to his head as a 13-year-old. The police kicked the door into his home, looking for someone with his same name that was 50. He was 13. Another police officer describes walking through a department store back in the day. Remember when they used to have candy and you could weigh it in those big metal weighing things? He talks about walking through a department store with some white friends in a large Midwestern city where he felt someone grab him by his afro, so that'll tell you the era he was living in, hurled him to the ground, and started beating him with a metal candy weighing tray. And it was a police officer. He was 12, suggesting the police officer that he'd stolen candy. When he turned his pockets out and found no candy on him, told him he was lucky he didn't get hurt further and to proceed on his way. So the question is begged, what these officers, why did you become police? And nearly to a person, they said, we could do so much better for our communities than that. And the last story I'll share with you is one of the most heartbreaking interviews. That a police leader, former police leader in a Midwestern city, said that when he was first police, probably in the 80s or 90s, at any time he heard there was a suspect on his police radio that was black or brown, he would race to the scene outside of his jurisdiction so that he could take custody of the black or brown suspect and protect them from being beaten or killed. What he did on the job as a black police officer, whenever he heard a suspect arrested, he would race to the scene, take custody of the suspect, put him in his police car, and lock the doors so that his fellow police officers wouldn't harm him. So that's the trauma we're talking about in policing. Something that I think is really important for us to think about as we think about the culture of policing in the United States. It's a culture, not a few bad apples. Our research uncovers. So let me conclude with a final thought because I didn't get to say this when I was doing my introduction. I am so excited about being a part of Widener University. I think Commonwealth is a fabulous law school. I think you are fortunate to be here with a faculty and a staff that care about you, that want you to succeed. I'm telling you, I have taught at 4 or 5 other law schools. They're not all that way. I've been on a few faculties where the faculty care a lot more about appearing on CNN, getting their book out, than they do about the success of students. I'm delighted to be a part of Commonwealth Law School, and I have been so impressed with you all. Several of you were in my interview. That's why I said yes immediately when Miranda said, will you come out and speak to us? I didn't even know if I was going to have this job or not. And I said, yeah, I'll come talk to you guys. I am so excited to work together with you and to lift each other up, lift up the status and stature of this place, and to be a part of moving this ball forward in a very aggressively belonging kind of way. So thank you so much for being here tonight, and let us hear your questions because I know these guys got answers. So let's hear them. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name's Eli.
Eli?
I'm a 1L here. And my question was, when you were talking about the ACEs, this was the first I heard about any of this. And you guys were talking about it in links to body weight obesity. Was there any discovery into like mental illnesses and that kind of thing, or was it curtailed?
Yep. You want to take that, Dean Clark? Was there any evidence as far as mental illness was concerned?
So the original study was it wasn't that there was a lack of desire to explore mental illness. It was just the foundation for this whole idea of ACEs grew out of a study on obesity, because the clinic that Dr. Felitti was overseeing was an obesity clinic. And so what he was trying to figure out is why he was having some difficulty in failures in terms of people that were participating in his obesity clinic. They would leave the clinic and then they would automatically gain the weight back. So he was solely focused on that. But what has happened was, as a result of him learning that information about how obesity was tracked with respect to the adverse childhood experience that the participant had experienced, that's when he came up with these 10 categories that Professor Cummings was mentioning. And then out of those 10 categories, part of it is there's a lot of research out there today that talks about how the impacts of ACEs impact sort of your mental health. So there is a lot of work done around that, but the original research was not about that, but it has been extrapolated and extracted to apply to that context.
I am sure also, Eli, that I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I know our research indicates that folks are more likely to suffer from mental illness, having suffered more traumas as a child. So there's a correlation there as well. What else do you guys got? Yes, what's your name?
My name is Kendra.
Kendra.
Yes. My question is for Professor Ellis. At the end of his time, he was talking about something that he would want to like talk about towards the end, like during questioning, with like the three things that, you know, like how to move forward from the kind of decisions that we got in like the Harvard case versus the Alabama gerrymandering case. Like, how do you kind of reconcile that, and like what's really, you know, how do we move forward from that as well?
Did you hear that question?
Yes, I take the question as one part delving into reconciling the opposites that the Harvard case and the Allen case represent, and how to get out of that trap. Well, the trap is colorblindness. And another way at this, I think, is to say that if you look at the people who signed the Harvard opinion, right? It was, of course, Chief Justice Roberts, who then also wrote the opinion in Allen. But the other votes, well, one way at this is to say, well, let's see which justices have had sort of the most robust history around colorblindness in the affirmative action context, as well as colorblindness or, you know, antipathy towards the Voting Rights Act. So conceptually, these two things link in terms of thinking about, well, how important is it to think about race as a determining factor in the political community? And I'll acknowledge that Professor Ramirez correctly pointed out early in his discussion that race is a social construct, but the reality is that race as a social construct has salience for political organization. So even though it is imaginary, we all collectively believe in it. And I mean, the ultimate hope is that we live in a day where we disbelieve that. But colorblindness tells us that if we just treat people with formal equality, then that will sort of eliminate the problem. However, any conception of colorblindness has to really begin with where it took hold in the constitutional in constitutional doctrine. And I will get to the modern court in a second, but you made me realize that I did not do what I usually do, which is to say the first prominent mention of colorblindness is in Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson. Our Constitution is colorblind, knows no respecter of values. If you look at that paragraph in its entirety, the first thing he says is the white race is superior, and so shall it be if it holds to notions of constitutional liberty. But in the eyes of the law, our Constitution is colorblind. That's the full idea. I think that there are those who embrace the formality of that idea without saying the white supremacy part. Justice Thomas does, because he's been wanting to abolish the Voting Rights Act for the entirety of the time he's been on the court. Justice Alito does, in as much as he modulated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act with no evidence whatsoever, just declared a test that narrows its application. um, justices to do Justice Kavanaugh, who was the deciding vote in Allen, said in his concurrence, in as much as he thought this was not the right case to re-question the Voting Rights Act, but he basically hinted, I will take the right case when it comes and vote the other way. So this is, in a practical way, why I think these two things sort of overlap, right? The formal equality notion embraces this long history that I laid out in my remarks. So the question becomes how to get out of it. And I think getting out of it, in addition to the three things that I already said, let me drill down on the first. I was with Professor Cummings and Professor Ramirez at a conference last month, and we were discussing how to reimagine the Constitution. And one of the points I made was the point I made to y'all, which is letting go of founder hagiography. Let me say 30 seconds on what I really mean by that. What I really mean is there are a lot of beliefs about this virtual infallibility of our constitutional system, and that a lot of the presumptions towards the laws that get passed via this system are taken for granted. In fact, I would argue this is why you saw what Professor Ramirez was arguing in terms of the declarations of war on drugs and all of that are sort of presidential fiats based on a sort of belief in a sense, the imperial presidency. And so my point is we need to let go of notions like this. We need to sort of ask hard questions about how our Constitution can change to really embrace democracy. One step that I could suggest is, as Dean Franita Tolson at University of Southern California has argued, maybe we need a constitutional amendment that actually takes power away from states and gives it to the federal government, creates a uniform constitutional structure for running elections, and proceeds from there. Or another way, as my friend Josh Douglas at the University of Kentucky has argued, is doubling down on state constitutions as a counterbalance to federal law. We can deal with things like partisan gerrymandering via state constitutions if we can't change the federal constitution. But I think there is a real conversation about inclusive democracy that is race conscious, that is necessary. And that doesn't take the courts, that doesn't take a vote, that doesn't take amending the Constitution. That takes pronouncing and opposing the subtle racism that it comes with formal equality driven by color blindness. And it requires naming that as such in order to get there. So there's my thoughts.
We have time for one or two more questions. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Magali.
Magalik?
Yeah.
Magalik.
So this is actually based on something Professor Ramirez had on one of his slides regarding record expungements. I know that that's not something that's like statewide. For example, I come from a state where you have to go back to the DA and ask them to seal that. Obviously, they require you to pay, and it takes a long time. That being said, if we believe this idea that like if you do the crime, you do the time, but why is that still a barrier put on people to kind of like get rid of that, even though they've already paid their dues to society?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Professor Ramirez, you want to talk about expungements? Did you hear the question?
Yeah. So this was part of the Illinois Social Equity Act with respect to the legalization of cannabis in Illinois. And what we saw was an incredible amount of administrative sort of red tape and delay in terms of getting expungements done. And I think the right way to do it is just have in the statute that it must be expunged, that you have to have a statute that says, as of this date, all cannabis convictions are hereby expunged. And now the burden is very, very much on the state to see to it that they don't communicate that someone has a conviction when they don't, right? It becomes almost an actionable tort to say this person has a conviction when in fact it's been expunged. So I think that the idea of automatic expungements, which is something that we've seen in other contexts, needs to really take hold with respect to the war on drugs, because you're talking about such a radically high number of people who've been ensnared in this over the years, not just people in jail today, but people who've been in jail since 1970 when this nonsense started. So given the large amount of people out there, the only way to do it effectively, based in part on what we saw in Illinois, is to make those expungements automatic. And now all of a sudden, if the state doesn't do it in the face of that kind of mandate, then they're on the hook monetarily for any damages someone suffers as a result of being portrayed as a convict when they were supposed to have achieved this automatic expungement. And you could even have like a statute of limitations. You could have a private action embedded in the action. We can do it. We can do it. It's not that with all the computer power that we have nowadays, it can be done. The problem is that it takes resources, it takes effort, and you need to make it so. And we can draft statutes that do that rather than just saying that you're entitled to an expungement, requiring the individual to take action. We can make the expungement automatic, requiring the state to take action.
Last question. What's your name?
Yasmin.
Yasmin.
I think this is just like overall question. You guys talk about representation of like minorities and in other positions as judges and prosecutors and legislators. How do we get there when the last couple of years it just seems like we've had such a huge regression in terms of making our way that like towards it? It just kind of seems like it's kind of falling apart, especially with the Supreme Court right now.
I'm going to give that to Dean Clark first, and then Atiba and Steve, you guys can jump in if you want.
You know, that's actually a wonderful question. And in fact, I was at Little Rock earlier this week, if I remember correctly, and I was presenting on this on an article that I just wrote that will be published at the University of Toledo Law Review about reversing DEI, IED, which I call it, indoctrination and elimination of diversity. And one of the things that I think is really important to note, which is that there are some tools that can be utilized by communities in order to push back. I talk a little bit about a more recent case. It's a corporate law case. It's entitled andré McDonald's. And I think that there are some other tools that are available, especially in the corporate context, to push back. But the best answer to that is the people in the room, the people at Delaware Law School, the students at Commonwealth Law School. One of the things that I think is so important is oftentimes we sit and we look at the news and we ask, well, what can those people do? The question has to be, what can we do and how do we make a difference? One of the things that is it's a gift and a curse, but social media, part of it is just about educating and reaching out and connecting with other people that are like-minded. If you have a company or you have entities that are failing to embrace diversity, one of the things we saw was that there was a substantial decline in the number of DEI-related positions after the SFA case and then the attacks on critical race theory, a substantial decline, but you have the power to change that. If there are institutions that do not recognize diversity, don't apply to those institutions. Don't watch their football games. Recently, there was a political figure in the state of Alabama, and anybody knows about Bama, football is big. And he says if Bama goes in the direction to attack DEI, then stop attending, and football players stop playing for the University of Alabama and go elsewhere. That's what you have to do, like vote with your power of the purse. And I think that that's really powerful and extremely impactful.
I would only add to that, I'm looking out at a classroom in Pennsylvania, and I'm seeing a very high degree of diversity in the room. And the message that I want to convey is that I graduated from law school in 1986, and I've got all kinds of classmates who are judges and served in state legislators or went into politics, you all need to reconceive and reimagine who you can be and to eliminate any limitations that may be lurking in your consciousness. You all need to look at yourselves and say, I can do whatever I want. I can be a leader in this society, and I can be a leader in favor of social justice and racial healing. And I would just say, like, reflecting on my own life, I'm perfectly happy as a law professor. And I think that being a law professor allows me to make statements that maybe politicians aren't necessarily permitted to make. I can be just a little bit more radical because I have the academic freedom of a law professor. You too can be a law professor. You too can pursue a career path to become a legal educator. It's open to everyone, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So think about yourself as an agent of change.
I would simply add two other points about this. Building on Dean Clark and Professor Ramirez's points, you are the change you seek in the world, right? And you can tell the story of change to others in order to create that transformation. I have suggested that there is a story about colorblindness that has been told that is, and the argument from those who believe in it on the right and on the left is that that's the only way to equality. That is not necessarily true. You conceiving of that of your own vision of equality, I think, is important, and telling that story to others matters a great deal. The other thing, vote. Now, I've read a lot lately about how the generations have sort of become dissatisfied with the choices that they have been presented. But part of that, I think, is the times we live in. But the reality of that is there are differences between the two sides. And without making ACS into a partisan discussion, which it is not, I think it is simply enough to say that the reality of the choice is the choices presented, and that we all have to make a choice among the decision that we have in front of us. We can wish for a better candidate, but part of that is the reality of exercising your power to let people know that you can choose a candidate, and then from the inside, make the argument for who our leader should be to who our leader is. And there is a difference. And making that known and making that decision happen is essential, especially with as critical as 2024 is as an election. So vote.
Love those dudes. Okay, I'm gonna take the last comment. So indulge me for 3 minutes as I tell you a story, and then I'll hand it back to Miranda and Molly. I was minding my own business, sitting in my office in Arkansas about 4 months ago. And a student came into my office and he said, Professor, my best friend is a world-renowned bull rider. Any of you watch bull riding? Do you know what it is? It's like rodeo, getting on the back of a bull. It's like the most dangerous thing you could possibly do in sport, like probably way more dangerous than the NFL. And he said, my best friend is the #3 bull rider in the world. His real name is Chase Outlaw. You guys can look him up. He's #3 a couple of years ago. And he said, Professor, the bull riders are being exploited by the Bull Riders Association. They need to unionize. Can you help them? I said, I can. I teach labor law, or I teach sports law. I know about labor law. I know that one of the best labor lawyers in the country. So the next week, Chase Outlaw and Bonner Bolton, look him up. He's been on Dancing with the Stars. We're sitting in my office in Arkansas, and we were talking about unionizing. And we called this labor lawyer in New York. And so that's not the story. The story is a week later, another student was sitting in my office, a woman, and she played volleyball, 6'3". We're talking about her current summer or her current clerkship at Dillard's. You guys know the department store Dillard's? Yeah. So she's an in-house counsel at Dillard's. We're just talking about how she could turn that job into a full-time job, from an internship into a full-time position. I was giving her strategies, and then she said, "Professor, you know what my dream job would be?" And I said, "No idea." She said, "My dream job would be representing as an agent professional bull riders." I said, "You come again?" She said, "My dream job would be to be the agent of bull riders. They're exploited and they need representation. They need someone to negotiate their contracts with their PBR, and they need someone to get them endorsements." So what did I say? "I know Chase Outlaw." She said, "You know Chase Outlaw?" I had never heard of Chase Outlaw before, but yeah, I know Bonner Bolton too. And she was, "You know what?" Anyway, long story short is set up a meeting, dinner, where Chase Outlaw, Bonner Bolton, William Streeter, Cassidy Brady, and I went to dinner. Fast forward, what are we now? March. So this is October, November, December, January. So 4 months later, Cassidy Brady just opened the Brady Sports Agency and has 4 bull rider clients: Chase Outlaw, Bob Mitchell, Dalton, Jesse Petrie, and Dalton Castle. Look them up. Right now, Dalton Castle is like number 2 in the world. She's representing bull riders. What does this have to do with Yasmin's question? You speak your reality into existence. You make it happen. You decide, "I'm going to represent bull riders." You go out and get 4 of the top 10 bull riding clients in the world. Or you decide, "I'm going to be a progressive prosecutor." You go out and you make that happen. Or, "I'm going to be a public defender." You go out and make that happen. Or, "I'm going to be a kick-A corporate attorney." Because the world needs people of color in corporate America too. That's the answer to the question. It's what Ramirez said, it's what Ellis said, it's what Clark says. You decide. That's what I'm going to do. And you are not going to take no for an answer. You do well in law school, you go out and smoke the bar exam, and you go out and do your thing. You can literally impact the world. I have no doubt that Cassidy is going to, well, I already know, she already negotiated the first team contract. You guys don't know that Professional Bull Riders has a team season now. So there's like 14 bull riders on teams, and she just negotiated a contract that got her client $50K more than he would have gotten if she hadn't negotiated it for him. That's real money for him and his kids. So anyway, that's my point. Is decide that where you have a vision for your future, and you make that vision happen, speak it into reality. Don't let anyone tell you no, and you keep going after it until you get it. So that's the social justice message for all of us. That you work hard for social justice. I'm not afraid of SFFA. I'm not afraid of it. I'm going to be the dean of a law school, and we're going to care about belonging and diversity. And I'm not afraid of SFFA. And neither should anyone else be, because the real motion and movement should be towards inclusion, making sure everyone feels like they belong, and making sure that we are bringing people to this profession that have been historically shut out, left behind. That'll be part of what I do as dean. I know that's what Dean Clark's doing at Delaware. And if Atiba and Steve ever decide they want to be deans, that's what they would do too. So anyway, thank you all so much for being here tonight. And I'll turn it back over to Molly and Brad.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our speakers. This was absolutely incredible. Our turnout, our questions. I can't thank everyone enough. I don't really know what else to say. Please take more food. Feel free to stay a while, socialize. Thank you.